Today's presentation is on protecting our property from fires, floods, and other catastrophes. Boy, what a month that we've had, or really a year or a decade. This is really the decade of the disaster. We've seen hurricanes, fires, floods just in the last week, strikes that impact our supply chain, social unrest. Who knows what's next, right? We have lots of concerns out there, and our hearts go out to the people in the southeastern United States that were affected by Hurricane Helene. And the video of that disaster is just striking. What has happened there, and the loss of life, and the just massive loss of property as well. So we have major concerns about that, and it really leads us to, does it seem like we're having more disasters now than normal? Well, the data will lead us to believe that yes, and not just a little bit. Our disasters, billion-dollar disasters, have gone up significantly, and we're really looking at 3 to 4 times what it was 30 plus years ago. We're seeing a lot more of those. Now, some of that has to do with areas that are more developed than they were before, and so when a disaster happens, it's going to cost more money. But one of the key metrics that we have is how much do these disasters cost, and they're happening here. Well, how does that translate to Utah and to the trust? Well, unfortunately, it translates straight across. This year has been the biggest property loss year in the trust's history. We've had significant losses, and it's not just one single giant loss. It's several. And so we definitely have concerns about this. And as a loss prevention department, we want to try to help you prepare for these disasters that may happen so we minimize this. Oh, and by the way, this is our biggest loss year, and it ain't over yet. We've still got several months to go before we can close out this historic year. What has caused those losses? Well, fire, floods, hail, all of these have been a major part of the losses that we've seen. We don't get hurricanes in Utah, but we do get these things. We get severe weather, we get earthquakes, we get wildfires, and others things. So how do we go about dealing with these disasters? How do we go about preparing for these? Because they will happen. We will see disasters in our lifetimes and in our times working at our organizations. So we look at steps to preparation. Some of you are like, hey, we saw some of this stuff in the last webinar. You're absolutely right, because they're the same steps. We need to admit a bad thing can happen where we're at. We're going to evaluate our property exposures. What do we have? And what is out there that can cause us to lose that or damage our property? We need to create a plan around this. We need to get covered. We need to build our preparations and build our maintenance into these things and inspections. We need to be ready to act, and we need to test our planning and make sure it works. Those are the same steps that we see. Well, how bad of risk do we have in Utah and the Intermountain West? Well, this is an interesting map here that shows the areas with higher risk of natural disasters and other disasters. Well, guess what? We have a fairly significant amount of red in the state of Utah. Can we drill down in that? And the answer is yes. We don't have to do a whole lot of work to find out what our risk is, because the federal government has already done that. The Federal Emergency Management Administration, FEMA, has developed a risk index equation. National Risk Index, they call it. And that's for individual communities, counties, and states. And so we take some factors in that. We looked at the expected annual losses, and those are things that are fairly easily quantifiable. It's been done for a long time. The insurance industry absolutely does this, as well as the trust. We calculate what our expected losses are, And then we take some other things into consideration: the social vulnerability and the community resilience. And you say, well, what the heck are those things? Well, social vulnerability is simply the fact that some populations are more vulnerable than others. If we have a hospital or a senior care facility, something like that, a long-term care facility, that population is going to be much more vulnerable to a power outage or another type of disaster that could happen than a population who is young and healthy and able to move and be able to leave a particular area due to an evacuation due to a problem that happens. So based on the types of communities that we have our social vulnerability and then the community resilience. Well, what does this mean? Some communities are better prepared than others to deal with disasters. And fortunately, as I look through communities in Utah, almost everyone gets a high rank on community resilience. For a long time, our communities in the state of Utah have worked really hard to be prepared. And we're much better prepared than the majority of the country, just because of a cultural factor that we have in Utah. We want to be prepared. Well, you take that expected loss, you times it by our social vulnerability, and you divide it by the community resilience, and that gives you a risk index. Now, most of you probably don't really care about the math on it. What does it give us? Well, it gives us a map like this that shows us how susceptible we are to a disaster. Now, if you look at the bottom, and I'm going to show you a couple of different maps from using this tool, but at the bottom there is a website or a URL that you can use to get to this map, and it's interactive, and you can go in and see exactly what your risk index is for your community. So you take a look here and see, well, Utah has some areas. I'll move to the overall Utah map, and you can say we have some areas that are pretty low risk, and then we have some areas with some moderate to high risk. Where are those areas? Well, unfortunately for us, it's the populated part of the state, the Wasatch Front, Washington County area, into Iron County as well. So those are areas to look at. Well, I'll drill down just a little bit more. Won't take too much time on this because I imagine some of you out there will go and play with this tool to see what's available. Salt Lake County shows a relatively high risk index. Why is that? Well, as I look through that, part of that is the social vulnerability that is built into the population in Salt Lake County. But you can walk through or you can scroll through a report that will give you 17 factors in there or 17 different hazards that you may or may not be vulnerable to. One of those is hurricanes, and every county in Utah has low vulnerability to hurricanes. However, it will show different communities having vulnerabilities to floods, to wildfire, to earthquakes, and that's what gives us a higher level of risk. Okay, we want to get real. We want to say, what are our exposures? Here's the deal. We're not worried about hurricanes. We're worried a little bit about tornadoes, but they don't happen very often. But there are some things, if you live in southern Utah, you definitely have to be concerned about flash flooding. During the monsoon portion of the summer, when we have storms coming through, you keep your eye to the sky and you pay attention to the weather report, because a storm that is miles and miles away from you could impact your life when a flash flood comes down a canyon. And so know your exposures, know what your potential losses could be from those, and what is the likelihood that that will happen. Then we're going to rank those and prepare accordingly. I always recommend that we write these down on a piece of paper and make a ranking or a computer, of course, you can type that up and share that with your organization and say, here's our potential risk. This is where we need to focus our attention on our preparedness. So what are our real exposures? Severe weather is probably one of the most common ones in Utah. Fire and wildfire, floods, earthquakes, those types of things are probably our most common and sometimes our most destructive um, incidents that can happen, emergencies that can happen around the state. All right, so this particular webinar is talking about protecting our property. You have in your organization probably at least millions of dollars worth of real property that your organization owns. Some of you out there have hundreds of millions of dollars of real property. So this is real money. Some of these properties are historic. They've been around for a long time. Some of these are brand new and they are the latest and greatest in design. And probably a lot of you are kind of in between those, or you have a little bit of each. So property coverage is, as it compares to liability coverage, we're looking specifically at perils, at hazards that can hit your properties, fires, earthquakes, floods, those types of things. This is not liability for somebody else, but it's protecting your property. Okay. So one of the key things that we start out with on this is making sure we have adequate coverage for our property. Property insurance is something that is really a given for most organizations, just like it is for me in my home. I'm always going to carry homeowners insurance, even if my properties are paid off, because I don't have the money to just build another house and replace all of those contents if a fire should happen at my home. So having adequate coverage is important. Most of you are on this video or on this webinar because you partner with the trust for your insurance coverage, and the trust has a strong property program. That's one of the, we talk about why do we have insurance? Well, we have insurance for years like this, where we have a banner year for property losses. We've had a lot of damage and destruction out there. So we have a really broad form to cover your properties, and we're specific to public agencies. There are questions that you have to ask. What should I schedule? And that, when we say schedule, that means insure, right? I'm going to include this property on my property schedule, and that adds the property insurance. Well, there are a lot of questions around this, and this is not a sales pitch webinar. You have coverage with the trust, and I want to make sure you understand a couple of things about that. But if you have questions, please contact your risk finance consultant for that. You can contact us as well, and we can get you in touch with them. But they're the coverage folks that can ensure that you have the appropriate coverage, appropriate valuations for your buildings that you're putting on there, or other properties, because it's not just buildings that go under property coverage. Some of you have individual programs. If you're a large organization, some of you have an individual program as well, and they're happy to help out with that. Well, just a couple of things with the property program. We have our My Trust member portal, and you can look at your properties. You can look at the valuations and look at your vehicles and see, do I have everything covered that I want to have on my schedule, right? Do I have everything scheduled that I want covered by insurance? Said that backwards. We have free property evaluations. We have those valuations done on a regular frequency. They'll look at that and see, did the value of this property increase? And in the trust program, it's replacement cost less your deductible. We include first and third party cybersecurity, first and third party pollution coverage, and increased crime limit as well. So once again, if you have questions about your coverage, we'll definitely get you in touch with your risk finance consultant. That's Ryan and Darren. and Curtis and Josh will be the folks that will help you out with that. The Some other thoughts about this. You need to know your property. It's not just buildings. Like I said, it can be raw land, parks, playgrounds, cemeteries. And you say, why do I want to put my playground on our property coverage? What's going to happen to a playground? Unfortunately, we've had playgrounds that were burned in an arson attack. Somebody poured gasoline across the playground equipment, lit it on fire, and we had a total loss of a playground structure. Well, in today's world, those playground structures can cost tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so let's not overlook the types of property that we may need to protect. Things like water and wastewater infrastructure. You look at that and say, well, it's all made out of concrete. Why do I want to put that? Why do I want to cover that? Well, we've had fires and other incidents that have happened that have our damaged our infrastructure like that. Intellectual property, cyber, of course, we talked about that just a little bit. If you have high value items, something that would be considered fine art, let's say you have some paintings that are extremely valued or highly valued in your buildings. Well, what happens if the building burns down and you didn't have that scheduled at the value that it bears or bore? Well, it would be canvas and a frame when it's looked upon as property damage. So if you have things like that, and sometimes we have these things out in our communities, sculptures, statues, things like that, that may be high value, high intrinsic value, we want to specifically schedule those. And then the contents of your building and buildings. And just on this one, you can take off your work hat at the same work hat and think about your home. What happens if your home burns down right now? You're at work and you come home and it's a total loss. Had a neighbor in my community have this happen, not to his home, but to a shop that he had, and it burned everything that was in there. This is an older gentleman, and he had his entire life's collection of tools. He was a great woodworker and still is a great woodworker. He just doesn't have the tools anymore, and it destroyed all of these tools. Well, as I was talking with him, I tried to help out where I could in response to this fire that happened. And as we were chatting about that, he talked about the process he was going through, trying to recreate all of the different tools that he had, so he could get coverage for the or reimbursement for the loss of his tools and the contents of his building. And he knew he had plenty of value in tools to get to his limit on his insurance policy, but he couldn't remember everything that he had. So here's a really simple thing to do. Take a walk with your phone and take a video of the contents of your facility. You don't have to get super detailed on exactly what all those contents are, but walk slow enough that you could be able to go back and say, oh, there's that and that and that, and be able to put those on a list. Now, it'd be great if you had an inventory of all of those things, but if that doesn't exist, something as simple as a video can help recreate what those contents were. All right. So know what you've got, and maybe know what it's worth. What do we schedule? I want to make a conscious decision about that. If I've got a bunch of Beanie Babies, those younger folks that are out there, you don't know what they are, and be glad of that. That was a time we should forget. You got a bunch of these Beanie Babies. They were once worth a lot of money. Now they really aren't worth anything, except maybe just a plush toy. that our kids might want to play with if you could allow them to pull the tag off. That was a silly thing for a while. People thought these Beanie Babies were going to be their retirement. Well, you know what? I'm not going to schedule my Beanie Baby collection because it ain't worth much, right? It's just some basic contents to my building. But when you make a decision to not schedule things, make sure that you have gone through a process to ensure that the decision makers in your organization know what we're doing. Hey, we're not going to insure this building because of whatever decision that we've made or a playground. Well, that's an important decision because if it is lost in a fire or damaged in some way, and you've made a decision not to schedule it, well, then the coverage isn't there. So take the time to make those decisions. Okay. Review your schedule at least annually. Make sure they're listed correctly and look at the values and ensure that the values are reasonable for what you're dealing with. If you have on there a low value and and that's what you insure it at. Um, don't think that that's, hey, we get cheaper insurance. Well, it's insured for the value that you have, and that's what you'd be covered for. All right. So make sure it's listed correctly. Make sure you have their values right. My Trust, once again, makes it easy to see what your schedule is, and you can talk to us if you haven't dealt with My Trust so far. Let's talk about perils that we may see: fires, floods, storms, earthquakes, crime, cyber, and some specialty. Just realize that your risks are specific to your location, your organization. If you're where we are here in Davis County gets east winds, unlike anywhere in the state. And sometimes we will have hurricane force winds here in Davis County, and it knocks a lot of trees down, damages buildings, tips over trucks on the freeway. Um, and and we may not have the same exposure here in Davis County as southern Utah has with flash floods. If you're in Bryan Head or Altatown, you deal with heavy snow loads. And so we need to make our considerations about what type of construction we have on our buildings, all of that based on the specific risks that we have. If you are in an area where you have significant exposure to wildfire, you're going to make very different landscape decisions and fire protection decisions than you would if you're not in an area that has wildfire exposure. So fire's the original property peril. That's where the original insurance came from. I grew up hearing about fire insurance. It wasn't homeowners insurance. We really wouldn't worry about anything else. It was about fire. Well, fire comes from different sources. There's the wildland fires that we're seeing in Duchesne County right now, and we're hoping that everything goes well with that situation out there. And then there are internal fires. So inside of our buildings involving electrical or flammable materials, things like that. Floods. Where did the flood originate? It's important if the flood originates inside of your building or outside because it's a different type of coverage for those two things. What is your risk of flooding? What is your zone? There are FEMA flood zones that will really be important in what your risk of flood and really what your cost of coverage is going to be. Storms, wind, hail, snow loading, temperature extremes, all and on and on. These are the types of perils that we may see with our organizations. Earthquakes. Utah is earthquake country, and so there are zones, and there are really micro zones where if you're living right along a fault line or maybe in a liquefaction zone, you have higher exposure to damage if an earthquake does exist. When we had the large earthquake back in 2020, um, it was during COVID lockdown. I was working at home, and and when I felt that earthquake come, I'm like, wow, this is kind of cool. But as I was comparing stories with some of my coworkers, they were terrified. their house shook. Now I was a little further away, but these people had some really terrifying experiences from the earthquake, and a big part of that could be from liquefaction or just specifics of where the location where their home was located. Utility disruptions are a big part of that. I got to keep going here. Time, crime, um, whether that's internal or external. We could have people break into our buildings or just walk into our buildings and steal property from us. Vandalism is also a side of this, but unfortunately, we can have people inside of our organization embezzle or misappropriate funds. And so these are crimes that we're all susceptible to. And do we learn from experience on that? Cyber is one of those crimes that unfortunately some of us are seeing on a regular basis. How many of you get a phishing attack on a regular basis? We're doing pretty good in our IT. For a while, we were getting a lot of phishing attacks coming through on email. I worked hard to make sure that I never responded and make sure I never clicked on those links. But sometimes they look pretty real. Okay. And then we have some specialty coverage as well. Because we're local government agencies, you may have canine officers. And so we offer protection for those. Drone protection, builder's risk when we're building a new building. So once again, you talk to your risk finance consultant about that type of coverage if you have those exposures. So property loss prevention. This is where we finally got to. What do we do to plan and prepare ourselves and our facilities for these types of property exposures? Well, once again, we want to build a plan around this. And really, this process starts at the design and purchase of property. Sometimes, and I put on here artsy buildings, sometimes we hire architects and they want to make this beautiful building that nobody's ever built before. Well, the challenge with that is repairing that may be very difficult. It may be extremely expensive. And so there's a certain level, yeah, we want beautiful buildings. We want buildings that inspire people, but let's not build dumb buildings, right? Let's not build buildings that are going to be difficult or impossible to repair should there be something bad happen to them, an earthquake or fire or you name it, a car driving into your building. Um, use your building officials and your fire staff in the area to help you build in to your facilities the proper design and fire protection as you're building those together. Put a facility inspection program in place so that we're looking at those things. And we'll talk about that just a little more in a second. And then a preventative maintenance program. Simple things like going out and cleaning our storm drains, cleaning the gutters on our buildings, getting up on the roof and inspecting the condition of the building can prevent these fire or these property damages that can happen, particularly from flooding. But as we look at our property risks, we want to do facility inspections and document those at least monthly. We want to have regular inspections of our fire suppression system, make sure that the fire riser is accessible, that your sprinklers are in operation, or that they are operational, uh, and that we have proper pressures, that we have replacement sprinkler heads, that those things are all in good condition. Make sure that our fire sprinklers are not blocked, that we're not storing materials that would prevent them from working. Let's take a look at things like our emergency equipment, our fire extinguishers, and other equipment that may protect us. Our boilers and pressure vessels are areas that can cause us to lose our buildings if they're not managed appropriately. There's also, along with this, a requirement at the state level that they be registered and inspected. And we can help you get in touch with the boilers and elevators division of the Labor Commission, and they can do that registration and inspection of those. We want to have a tag and inventory on all of our equipment, particularly things like emergency equipment, so we know what to inspect each year or each month. Document those things as we go through. Part of our fire prevention program is that we look at where our wildfire is coming from and look at what those sources are. If it's from external, and we have wildland fires, well, there's some things that we can do to prevent a fire from happening. If we have fireworks happening around, well, that's a preventable cause of a fire as well. Arson is another thing. What type of construction is our building? Have we made it easy for somebody to be able to light it on fire? And then if we have fires from an internal source, where could they come from? A lot of times these are what I call dumb things. They're things like we get up on the roof and we start welding, and the sparks from our welding catch our building on fire. They're dumb things like having candles inside of your building. Open flames are a potential source of fire, and it's a really dumb way to burn your building down. Things like our space heaters that we may have in our buildings, leaving one of those on or having it operate in an area where we have combustible materials, a recycle bin of paper right next to that heater could cause our building to burn down. Electrical equipment, using extension cords where we shouldn't do that, having electrical equipment that's damaged or not put together right, not doing inspections on our equipment. Those are important things. Flammable liquids are another easy way. Gasoline or other flammable liquids stored in the wrong place, stored in the wrong container, or in the neighborhood of an ignition source can be another really dumb way to burn your building down. Then we want to look at prevention. How do we prevent this type of stuff? Well, how do I stop that fire from burning on the roof? Well, we have a hot work program. Anytime anybody's going to make a spark, anytime they're going to make a heat source or have an open flame, they need to have a hot work program. I have a full webinar on this, and probably up here somewhere you will see if you're watching on YouTube, you will see a link to go to that. So have a hot work program in place. This ensures that we are preventing fire from the outset and that we're watching what's going on when we do have to do hot work. A fire prevention plan. This is required by OSHA, but what can we put in place to prevent fires? Things like a no open flame policy, no candles. If we have space heaters, they need to be grounded properly. They need to be in a proper location and not left unattended when they're in operation. Have a policy around extension cords, that we don't use those where we shouldn't be using those, and we don't use those for extended periods of time, and we unplug them when they're not being used. How about the suppression system? If we have fire sprinklers in our building, they need to be tested, flow tested on a periodic basis, and most of you use a contractor to do that. But that is an essential part of that, is making sure the system works, making sure that our fire sprinklers are attached to a alarm system so we get quick notification when that suppression system is activated. If you impair your sprinkler system, that needs to be a mandatory notification to your management and at the trust. We would like to hear about that as well, so we know that you have fire watch in place and that it is back in service as soon as possible. All right. And one other thing on electrical, if you have large electrical systems, you're looking at something 480 volts or more, a regular thermal imaging test. Have a thermal image camera, and that can help you to identify if there's a problem in the system. When connections get loose or there's a problem with a connection drawing too much power, you can see that in a thermal image camera, and we can prevent the fire that could happen from that. Okay, I got to keep going. Fire prevention. from wildfires? Well, we need to look at our risks. If I'm in the middle of the city, I don't have the same wildfire risks as if I'm on the benches in the Wasatch Front, or I'm out on the edge of wildland out in rural Utah. And so I want to look at that. Look at that. What's our risk? And if we have that, we're going to put things in place like vegetation management, fuel management. There are opportunities for us to simply trim back vegetation, put green vegetation, things that are irrigated, that are not going to burn as easily if we do have a wildfire. So think about our plantings, think about where that vegetation is in relation to our buildings. And these are not just our main offices. If we have satellite facilities, a water tank or treatment works somewhere, it's the same thing. Let's look at our vegetation and how do we harden that area around there to prevent a fire from getting to our facilities. And preventing by design. Thinking about the materials of construction, if we're able to put materials in there that are fire resistive, or they don't want to catch on fire very easily, that's going to prevent those fires from happening. And then active fire suppression systems, putting in the sprinklers, and other fire suppression systems. We had an activation of our fire suppression system at our server here at the Trust. Years ago, when I first started working at the Trust, I did a risk assessment for the Trust, and I said, we have an exposure there. We had fire sprinklers, but fire sprinklers put out the fire, or excuse me, fire sprinklers control the fire. They don't put it out, but they control the fire. But we're still going to lose our servers, and so we put in a waterless system, and we had the failure of a battery backup system in the last couple of months, and it activated our waterless system and prevented the fire from happening, did not damage our servers. And even though we have to look back and go, darn it, we had a failure, our systems all worked. And so as we look at our buildings, as we look at what we use there, what can we do to shift the odds in our favor if something does go wrong? Floods. Floods have been one of our major causes of loss in the state of Utah forever. But particularly in the last several years, we've had significant flooding, and some places have been hit multiple times. So we want to know what our flood risk is. You can go to those FEMA flood zone maps, and you can see where, for your own home, as well as all of your buildings that you have, and determine what your overall risk is. Here's poor Moab. Moab's got hit a couple of times over the last few years, in significant fashion, where the entire city has basically been flooded. So we want to take a look at our overall floodwater system. For many of you out there, you are cities or counties or a district that deals with stormwater or floodwater systems. How are we designing that? And once it's designed, how do we maintain it? Are we actively going out and clearing debris? Are we making it easy for us to deal with a flood that comes? Many of the floods that we've seen over recent years have dealt with some kind of aggravating conditions as well, because they've had a forest fire or a wildland fire that has bared off a significant amount of territory. And then when torrential rains come after that, it brings a lot of debris and mud flows into the area. And so it makes it harder to deal with that. So let's make it as easy on ourselves as we can by clearing areas of vegetation and debris where these floods may come. Look at our design. Are we adequate for the flows that we may see? And this is one of those areas where you look at it, and the majority of the time, these are in desert areas where you rarely see water, but when it comes, it's disastrous. And so making that part of our regular maintenance, that we're clearing those debris, we're doing vegetation management in those floodways. All right. Um, and a few other things on flood preparations on our buildings. If we're dealing with the potential for floods around there, sometimes our landscaping can involve berms. Excuse me. Tickle in my throat. we may we may use landscaping berms to direct floodwaters away from our buildings, and we've seen that happen. Sorry, I've got a little tickle. We've seen that happen a number of times with members of the trust where their berms protected their property. But we've also seen where we didn't have berms where it was needed. We want to do fair weather inspection of our roofs. Get up on our roofs safely, and look at our drainage system on those roofs. Make sure that if we have a large storm, it's going to work. Make sure we are identifying damage to our roof before the floodwaters happen to come, the rains. Frost proofing our buildings so we don't have broken pipes in cold temperatures. Replace hoses. This is one you can check on at your home. If you have a washer and dryer, that washer should have those hoses replaced on a regular basis, probably somewhere between every 5 years to maybe 10, and that's probably stretching it a little bit. But for sure, when you get a new washer, you should replace those hoses because they can fail and flood your home while you're not there. Think of things like drip pans under your water heaters and floor drains in key locations so we can direct that flood water away so it doesn't get to the areas that we can't have getting wet. And then things like leak detection systems. Those are pretty simple. I have a weather station at my house, and I was able to hook up through that system, through a Wi-Fi system, just little simple flood or water detectors that I put down in my basement. And so if the basement floods, it sends an alert to the weather station, which sends an alert out to my phone. And so within a short amount of time, I will know that we've had a flood or a leak somewhere, and so I can prevent the damage from being worse than it should be. Earthquakes. We have our history with earthquakes in Utah. And if you look at this map, this shows the zones that we have, and obviously the Wasatch Front is the highest ranked zone, but know what your zone is. And like we said, there are micro zones out there that can make it worse than others. There are some things that we can do to prepare for earthquakes, like seismic bracing of certain things, like our fire suppression system, our sprinkler system. Um, Putting flex couplers on our gas appliances. What is that? Well, that's a hose. Instead of plumbing those rigid, I don't know why there are a lot of plumbers out there that pride themselves on making that rigid pipe go exactly where it needs to go, and it actually hurts us in an earthquake scenario. We want things to be able to move and not break our gas delivery system, and so those flex couplers are important. Things like anchoring our shelving, putting a screw into a stud on a wall behind a shelf, and so if things happen, that shelf's not going to come over. If there are things that are valuable that we have on shelves, how do we secure those in the event that an earthquake happens? And even if they're not so value, how do we keep that from hurting people? Keep stuff from falling off shelves and hurting people. Lots of resources available at shakeout.org and participate with that each year. Here's some of that seismic bracing that we talked about and the flex couplers for our gas systems. Cyber, we do have we have an application that you put in. There's a survey, and I know you guys love that a lot. It's a challenging survey with a lot of stuff. This is getting more and more complex, and we all need to be working hard to prevent this type of thing. So there are different types of hazards that we're dealing with cyber, direct access, people hacking into our system, denial of service. Maybe we have something that people are mad at us for whatever reason, and they release a swarm of bots to attack our websites or other networks that we use. Spoofing, phishing, all of those things. Let's talk about how do we prevent this stuff, build a team around it, and then build a plan. Know your enemies. Know who might have an axe to grind against you, and plan and prepare for those things. Build your system security. One of the key things is to have that multi-factor authentication. So you have to I put my password in it, but it's also going to ask me for a number that it sends me through my phone. So it just prevents people from easily getting into there. Firewalls, encryption, all those kind of things are in part of it. And then physical security of your devices. What happens if your phone is stolen? What procedures do we have in place? And can somebody get right to our stuff? And then test your system. The trust provides penetration testing to see just how good you're doing. Was an outside entity able to get into your system? Did people click on that link that happened? Remember, don't click on that link. Okay, we've talked about a lot of stuff today. Just to summarize, take a look at your exposures. What buildings do we have? What property do we have? Is it all on our schedule? What are the perils or the hazards that face our properties? What is our real exposure there? Plan and prepare for the most likely. Yeah, we're going to look at the less likely stuff as well, but we have plenty of work to do. Let's work on that most likely, and we're going to cover the longer term stuff as well as we do that. Regularly review your preparations. That means go out and do your inspections, make sure that everything's working, and then when you need it, you'll be ready. So we have covered a lot of stuff. Yep, looks like Mike's still on here, but he's got my picture on his. Earlier he was earlier.
It's because it's better looking.
Mike, do we have any questions?
No, no questions. No
No
questions here in the chat.
questions. All right, folks, if you got any questions, type them in the chat box. We'd be happy to answer those. Coverage questions, for sure, talk to your risk finance consultant. They're all in San Antonio right now to a conference. I'm holding down the fort here at the trust, but they would be happy to take your call if you do have those kind of questions. And Mike, anything?
We did have a question earlier on if we're going to send out this presentation. Yes, we'll send it out with the YouTube and all the resources Jason talked about.
Yeah, for sure. Lots of great materials that are available out there. Be Ready Utah, ready.gov are great sites as well, and shakeout.org are all wonderful web pages that you can get lots more information to help out. So, and we're recording the session. We'll put it up on our website later today, and send out an email with all the follow-ups. So, folks, thank you so much. Appreciate your time and attention here. Go out. Let's be proactive. Let's make sure we're ready when and if the bad thing does happen. Go out and have a safe day.